All right, first of all, everyone, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Steven Zettel, and I'm recently been elected onto the IOGA Board of Directors as the Guide VP. So as things have been happening over the last little bit, it came to my attention that we should make a big informational meeting for our guides. So in December, the IOGA decided not to join the Colorado lawsuit that you may have heard of. And the next step for IOGA was to create the overtime committee. And I'm also a member of that overtime committee, as several outfitters and other guides from IOGA as well. The rule that we're dealing with, the executive order, is over 240 pages long. And throughout it, minimum wage and overtime is addressed, but there isn't a single sentence that just says, guides should be paid more or anything like that. There's a great deal of nuance and interpretation that we're going through as a committee and as a group that is really going to affect how guides are paid. And it's not nearly as cut and dry as a lot of people would like it to be. I'd also like to address the fact that the major issue that we're dealing with here is, in fact, the overtime component. As we've talked a lot in our committee, minimum wage is not really the concerning piece. It's, in fact, that's why we named ourselves the overtime committee. And that's why we're focused on that portion of it, because I believe that's what's going to be the most difficult thing for guides and outfitters moving forward. As far as the agenda for this meeting will be, we're going to do about a 10 or 15 minute presentation from Leah. And then following that, there'll be a Q&A. As the Q&A goes, we're going to really try and stay away from personal examples, personal attacks, anything like that. We're going to try and leave names out of it. If you have questions, that's great. We'll have you use the chat function, I believe. We'll see how that format works as we go through it. We got a lot of people on here, which is super exciting. I'm so glad that that's the case. So there'll be a chat. Lauren is in the background helping us out with that. She's going to try and send them to me, and we'll work through them as we go, try and lump together questions that are similar. Unfortunately, some of the answers for you guys may be unknown. They may be variable. We don't know everything, but we're working hard all the time to get there. So please bear with us. We're going to answer questions that we can, and there may be some that we can't. So really appreciate you guys' patience on that and that kind of thing. Kind of rolling into the last step of this introduction, Aaron Lieberman and Leah Corrigan and myself, we're all guides. We have been guides in the past. We will probably continue to be guides in the future. Most of the outfitters we work for are all guides now, or were guides in the past. So we want to keep this a conversation of how guides and outfitters are working together, not a guides versus outfitters type of situation. The last thing I'd like to say before I kick it over to Leah is, please, outfitters, if you're here and you didn't invite your guides, that's not great. That's a bad step right off the bat. So please think about that. And as we move forward, get your guides involved and try and get us on the right track on that. So with that being said, I'm going to kick it over to Aaron first. He's going to introduce himself. Then Leah is going to introduce herself, and then we'll roll into a little presentation.
All right. Thanks, Steven. For those who don't know me, I'm Aaron. I'm the executive director of Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association. I think I've been looking at the names coming in here, and I think I do know most of you. I'll keep it pretty short for my part. Steven's really done the lion's share of lifting and putting this together, and I really appreciate it. Looks like we do have a really great turnout. A lot of guides, good number of outfitters, and thanks to all the outfitters who did reach out to your guides, let them know about this, and who've been sharing information. I've been copied on some of those as they've gone out, and looks like there is really an effort for everybody to be brought in here. So I'll leave it there for now. This is obviously a big ticket issue. It's been a big focus for IOGA recently. Once Stephen will keep us prompted on the agenda as we go forward. But for my part, that's it. Leah?
Thanks. Hey, everyone. My name's Leah Corrigan. I am presently a lawyer. I hope to not be a lawyer forever and would prefer to be a guide actually, but here I am on a Zoom screen in an office. I spent about 10 years as a multi-day guide, much of that time in Idaho. A lot of my closest buddies are guides, and a lot of my clients are outfitters or your employees. So I can't remember who asked me to do this. My initial reaction was, why the hell would I want to stick my foot in that hot mess? And then when I thought about it a little bit, I thought that misinformation and confusion is never helpful to anyone. And I care deeply about my clients, my friends, and the fact that what's going on here is really kind of a industry changing event. And I think it's important for everyone to know what is going on, what isn't going on, and just try to give you a basic sense of what's happening. So I'm going to put a presentation up here and go through a couple of things, but while I'm doing that and getting that set up, if you could in the chat, if you have no idea what's going on here, let us know that. Just put no idea. If you have some idea, put that. And if you have a pretty good idea, put that. And that way I can tailor what I'm saying to the knowledge level of whoever's on this call. If you have no idea, that wouldn't be surprising. Most people don't. Like when we're talking about the committee and the wage and hour stuff and the Obama EO and all of that, some of you could be going, I don't even know what the heck you guys are talking about. So that's helpful to know, because when we're in the weeds, we often don't know what everybody else knows. So that's all coming in. That's super helpful. And then Lauren, maybe if you could tally that up, if you can, that would be really great for everyone to know. So I'm going to share my screen. It'll take me a second to do that. Aaron, will you nod if you can see that? All right, cool. Okay, so what we're talking about is there was an executive order under Obama that was taken away by Trump and then reinstated by Biden with some different rules. And what that executive order did was have a big impact on minimum wage and on overtime rules. And as you guys know, as guides, we're not working in Costco punching a clock where it's all really straightforward. You guys are out there on the river, some of you on multi-day trips. And so the whole analysis is pretty confusing and pretty impactful. Sometimes in good ways for guides and in other ways, not so good. And that's what we're going to talk about. A couple of caveats. Lawyers love disclaimers, but my interest in these disclaimers is not to try to shut anything down, but just to kind of tell you where we're at. We hope to, and this may or may not involve me, have a session number 2 that's a little higher level where we can address some more top level questions that you all might have. At this level though, for this first campfire talk or presentation or whatever we're calling it, I'm trying to make it pretty simplified, because this document with the executive order that your employers are looking at and trying to figure out is 240 pages of legalese, exceptions, exemptions, examples, caveats, all of that. It's really super complicated, even from a lawyer's perspective. So I'm going to introduce the concepts and talk about some of the issues. And that's the point here today. Another important point, I'm not anyone's lawyer here right now. There are a lot of the outfitters in Idaho are my clients. If you're on the call, you're not my client for this call. For you guides, no one here is my client. No one's paying me. This is a volunteer effort. I'm just trying to help here. For that reason, please be respectful with your questions. So if you ask me an example of, well, my outfitter is saying this or doing this, I'm not going to answer that question because A, it could be a client of mine, and B, it's inappropriate to answer questions that are not fully formed or not fully understood. And then lastly, in this presentation, I've intentionally excluded a lot of the technical terms, exceptions, exclusions, exemptions, examples, and other things that aren't really germane to the basic concepts that we are introducing to you today. There's a lot of big words and legalese, and I've tried to take that 240 pages and put it into about 10 slides so everyone can get a sense of what's happening here. So with all those disclaimers, we'll jump into it. Okay, so we're talking about Executive Order 14026. The number doesn't matter, but I thought I'd throw it up there. It is an executive order that increases the minimum hourly wage for, among others, federal contractors. A federal contractor, for our purposes in this room, is any outfitter that's operating on federal lands as a federal contractor. This executive order also increases overtime pay for anyone operating on a federal permit. Does a lot more than that, but for our purposes, that's what's important. Let me give you some history, because you may have been hearing things about this for the last few years and wondering, if this isn't new information, why are we talking about it now in January of 2022, when you're starting to get your trip schedule and try to make plans and et cetera? Why is all this happening now? And the reason for that is the rule was put in place, taken away, and then put in place in a different form with a deadline of January 30th, 2022. And understanding that history helps you understand why this seems like new news, even though the beginnings of this happened under Obama. So in 2014, President Obama signed the first executive order, and that set the new minimum wage at $10.10 per hour. It also set a minimum cash hourly requirement for tipped employees. This is super important for guides, and you'll understand that in a minute. $4.90 an hour starting in 2015, and then gradually increasing to 70% of the minimum wage over a period of years. I'll explain what that means, but that's what happened. In 2018, President Trump suspended the application of this rule to guides and outfitters, meaning he took Obama's executive order, tore it up, and said, never mind, guys, none of this applies, don't worry about it. Then in 2021, President Biden reissued an executive order on that federal minimum wage that reimposed the Obama rule with some additions on to guides and outfitters. So that's the history of it. So what does this executive order do exactly as it relates to outfitters and guides in Idaho? Point number one, it increases the minimum wage. So that's an hourly rate. Now, a lot of you are paid in day rate, so everyone's going to have to do some math here, but it increases the minimum wage. So minimum wage will increase to either $7.90 per hour or to $10.50 per hour for tipped employees. This, whether it's $7.90 or $10.50, depends on when your outfitter's permit was actually issued. So that gets a little complicated. If you are a non-tipped employee, I'm not going to spend much time talking about that because most guides are hopefully making tips. If you're a non-tipped employee, those numbers are a little bit higher. You can see them there on the screen. Importantly, tips are reported and calculated into this wage. So if you are making, on a middle fork trip, if you're working about 16 hours a day without sleep time and you're making X dollars an hour, in order to get you to that minimum wage for tipped employees, that your employer has to take a tip credit, which means that your tips are going to have to be reported and calculated into that wage. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone here in this Zoom call doesn't report all of their tips. I always did, of course. But if you don't happen to do that, and no one's making you do that right now, that's a big deal. It really changes the math that you're going to walk home with in the fall. Number 2, this executive order increases overtime pay to 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. As Stephen said in the beginning, this whole issue of minimum wage, none of the outfitters are super worried about that, because when you count in tips, or even when you don't, most of you folks we're already making this anyway. So that's not that big of a deal. It matters for tips and tip reporting, but in terms of outfitters' bottom line and whether this is a business ending problem, that's not the big deal. The bigger deal is overtime pay. So the executive order increases overtime pay for any federal permittee, any outfitter, to 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. This starts at 40 hours. And my interpretation is it probably doesn't include sleep time, but it includes every other bit of time that you're on the river. I don't think there's anyone here that works a summer season in Idaho that isn't working significant amount of overtime as it's calculated by the federal government. So those are the 2 big things that this executive order is doing. Also, the hourly minimum wage going forward will be determined by the Secretary of Labor annually. So starting January of next year, rather than the minimum wage not increasing for a while and then bumping up depending on who's in office, the Secretary of Labor will start to establish that on an annual basis. So that is, in a nutshell, what's happening with this executive order. So we talked about that, and I can take any questions on that, but not until we get to step 2, where we're talking about how this applies to you. Okay, what else in this 240 pages did I pick out and Aaron pick out as extremely relevant to guides? Tips are factored in, and thus it's going to be difficult not to report them to the IRS. That would have mattered tremendously to me, so I'm mentioning that here. It's also not very clear what hours in a guide's life are, quote, overtime. If you were thinking about your day on the river, wherever you work, and trying to figure out, well, what is overtime? Like if I'm not on cook crew and I'm hanging out, and I go take a bath and I grab a beer and do a little stretching, talk to a guest I like, ignore the ones I don't, am I in overtime? Or what about right before you fall asleep, if you have to hop up onto the shore and tighten your line because the water's coming up? Was your sleep interrupted, and are you in overtime then? It's this very confusing thing. So if you're an outfitter, or if you're a guide or a guide manager and you're trying to figure out what's overtime, it's not as simple as if you're managing Costco or some grocery store or something. It's just a totally different analysis. Also, another important thing in this 240 pages is employers can take deductions, they're called, for things that they are now providing informally. Like if you have some guide housing, or if you are allowed to eat food on a trip, which I hope you all are, employers can take deductions of meals and guide housing. And in order to do that, they need to figure out what it actually costs and what's actually fair and what they want to do. And also with guide housing, that's a whole other complicated thing. I've tried to break this down into just my view. And, this is just me trying to explain things the way I see them. What are the potential positives for guides? I think for some employees, their total compensation could increase under this new rule. I think that's way less likely for multi-day guides. Some daily guides might see that increase, but they might not. The margins are pretty slim there. Another positive, I think, is that hourly minimum wage is going to probably continue to rise each year, which would keep pace with inflation. So you'd have a sense that your wage could keep some pace with the cost of living. those are some potential positives. Here's some potential negatives, just in monetary terms. For some tipped guides, you could actually make less money. The example that popped into my mind when I was trying to do this math based on my experiences, when I was doing a middle or a main trip with tips, if I applied this new rule, would I make more money or less money? The answer is less money, particularly if you're having to report your tips. Your hours could be cut, or your trip structure moved around in a way that you might not like, in order to avoid these hefty overtime pay requirements. Your pay structure will probably change. So a lot of us have been living in this world where you're making a daily rate, and that's pretty easy to do that math and pretty easy to understand how that factors into your life. And for me, it was pretty easy to understand whether it was worth it to me or not. Like, what's the daily rate? That's what I wanted to know. The pay structure is probably going to have to change in order to accommodate this math that employers are going to have to do. Also, employers are going to have to implement a lot more rules and paperwork. That, in my mind, is extremely unwelcome from the guide perspective also. The idea of more rules, more structure, all of that, to me, that's a bummer on just a straightforward emotional level. I don't think most of my friends that are guides, or me when I'm on the river, want additional rules that we have to comply with. And lastly, and most importantly, the fact of this situation is some outfitters that are operating on tighter margins are not going to be able to absorb this cost. I don't have a sense of how many outfitters won't make it, but some of them probably won't. And Aaron, chime in here if you have a better sense of this.
I don't have a better sense. I'd say I agree that in general, I think the cost increases and increased reporting and paperwork, besides cost increases, are significant enough that certainly some won't be able to cut it with the already close margins they have. I think there are ways for most to make it through, but I would agree with your overall summary there, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. How does this impact outfitters? And again, this is my list, Leah's list. Nothing magical about this, just my thoughts. Outfitters are going to see significantly increased payroll under this structure. That matters for all sorts of reasons. I mean, all of you on this call, especially those that showed up and care about this, you can pencil out how that might matter. Significantly increased payroll changes all sorts of little things, and those changes can trickle down or trickle across in a way that really impacts the life of a guide and the job of a guide. In order to meet the significantly increased payroll, I think trip prices are going to have to go up. And in my mind, when you jack up the price of the trip, you probably are going to have to do some things that justify jacking that price up. And some of those things might be things that guides don't want to do. Like, you know, if I was guiding a trip, I don't also want to have to give someone a massage or, you know, set up elaborate things. It may be the case that those increased prices means more things, more stuff to do. Also, there are other competing businesses that may have an exemption for these increased wages. So I think that this EO executive order will apply to most all outfitters in Idaho, or a lot of them anyway, but not everyone. And so that could create a situation where you have a competitor that's leaving their trip prices the same, they don't have to meet these requirements, and you have to jack up your prices. And that's going to create this weird dynamic with employees and with customers. You know, places like ski areas somehow got themselves exempt from this rule. So, you know, ski areas don't have to comply with this. There are really hefty record keeping and paperwork requirements associated with this executive order. Really significant, like the way systems that have been working for years, total redo. That's people are scrambling to try to figure out how to even meet the paperwork requirements. I also see that there could be some weirdness with pay scale differences for senior versus junior guides. Like there may have to be some more equalizing of pay scale, where if you've been running on the middle fork for 15 years, you're making the same amount of money as a second year guide. That never feels very cool, at least when you're the senior guide. That I think that's been the case in Grand Canyon for those of you that have connections with Grand Canyon. And then again, there's just a lot of rules associated with this, a lot of complication and a lot of risk. If you're an employer, you're not following the rules to the letter, documenting every single thing, putting posters where you need to, getting a bunch of signed things from your guides. If you're not doing all of that, there is a lot of potential risk, like big fines, all sorts of things like that associated to penalties from the federal government for not meeting the paperwork requirements. And that's going to be hard for some people, especially smaller businesses. Where are we here? We're almost through. So outfitters are dealing with kind of a complicated analysis. You know, as this thing has evolved, I'm on the phone all day about this stuff. And that's been the case for all of winter. Aaron, same thing. He's been on the phone constantly talking to people, trying to figure it out. Stephen and all of the outfitters that are on this overtime committee have been meeting for 2 hours a day, trying to get all of this sorted out. It's just super, super complicated. And I think what outfitters are thinking about is, how can I afford this? Can I afford this? In order to afford it, if a client booked a trip 2 years ago, can I increase the price now? How's that going to work? When do the price increases fall into place? Do I have to reduce the daily rate of some guides to compensate for having to increase the rate for other guides? When are guides on the clock for purposes of overtime? Do I need to take meal deductions or guide housing deductions? And what does that look like? Do I actually have to force guides to report all tips? And I'll tell you, this is one of the worst things from my perspective for my clients. My advice will probably be, you're going to have to do that. There's no way around it. And then do I have to reduce the number of trips, especially for multi-guides, in order to stay within those overtime rules? So this is just kind of a short list of, here's all the things that are being considered and trying to be worked out by outfitters right now. So if you feel some uncertainty from them, it's because they are uncertain and they're trying to work things out as quickly as they can. I can't speak for everybody, but my clients and the people that I've come in contact with are deeply worried, want to do the right thing by their guides, and are just trying to figure out how to make this whole cluster work. Another question that might come up for those of you that have been following this minimum wage thing on social media or elsewhere is, there was an article, I think in the Salt Lake Tribune, an opinion about this that had what I think were some kind of gauzy, maybe misstated facts, or at least pretty one-sided. And then there's been some stuff popping up on social media. And one of the questions is this actually going into effect? And the answer to that, I think, is yes, this is happening. There was a lawsuit that was filed by the Colorado River Outfitters Association and a couple of outfitters down there. There was discussion at IOGA about whether to join the lawsuit. Ultimately, the decision was made not to join the lawsuit, mostly for reasons that I can't speak for everyone, but I think the idea was it maybe just wasn't the right thing to do at the right time. That lawsuit is looking like it's going down in a ball of flames. I could be wrong about that, but there was a very negative order issued by the judge in Colorado, and I don't think that lawsuit's going to be successful at this point. There's also been some lobbying effort in DC that might change things a bit, but right now I think everybody's got a plan that this is happening, and we're all in it. Outfitters, guides, those of us that are trying to help the situation, everybody's kind of in this together. Final thoughts from me, and then I'll let Aaron jump in, or we can answer some questions. The reason I got involved in this, as I said, is because I felt like there was all of this misinformation circulating among my guide friends, and then all of this confusion circulating among the outfitters. And it was creating a situation where there was all this swirling about, but it was creating these different camps. Like somehow there was some division between interests here. And, you know, when I look at this situation globally, there is no division. There are different interests and things that may be better or worse for some people, but overall, I think this is going to be a big and kind of painful adjustment on all sides. It's not all net positives for guides. It's not all net negatives for outfitters. And I just wanted to do my best to try to clear that up as best I can for folks. So with that, Aaron, Stephen, feel free to jump in and give your 2 cents, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as I can actually answer.
Well, just before maybe jumping in, I'd say I think you covered it all effectively really well. Again, like Leah said, we're keeping this initial installment to 100,000 feet. I was going to say 30,000 feet, but truly, as Leah spoke to, this is deeply complicated stuff. I've spent, as Leah has, an immense amount of time trying to parse it, and there remain a lot of questions unanswered. So I'd say, sort of just as a segue, actually, I also want to reinforce something else Leah said, which is the calls that I've been getting from outfitters mostly have to do with how, like, just trying to wrap their heads around it and being concerned for how they can keep on out or continue to look out for their guides. And I think that stands in contrast with some of the coverage that we've seen, which is, you know, the outfitter looking to price gouge and or keep a livable wage. And I'm not trying to convince folks one way or another. I just say, from the experience that I've had, that hasn't been where folks are coming from. And I don't think it's that clear cut by any means. I think this will be a game changer for the industry, complying with this for guides and outfitters. I've run the numbers for myself as a guide, and I think I would probably make less if the folks I work for were in strict compliance. I think it's something we're just trying to work through together, and we can, and we will. But if we don't do it together, it's going to be a hell of a lot messier. With that, I'm happy to speak to anything else, Leah, and or, I mean, we both can speak to questions, but I'll pass it back over to Stephen.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. The one last thing that I would say is, you know, we kind of mentioned a lot of river outfitters and river guides on that deal, but this is hunting guides, backcountry ski guides, all guides and outfitters in Idaho, as I think Leah kind of mentioned that too. But, you know, I think a lot of river guide action gets talked about in our groups because everybody's so active, but this is for everybody, you know. So with that said, I'll look into some of these questions we've got here. I'm not sure how we want to divide them up, but I'll just read one. We'll start off with our tips. You guys let me know if it seems like it's good good or not. It says, if our outfitter doesn't have us report tips, would that make us a non-tipped employee?
Aaron, you can take all questions first. How
Okay.
about cleanup?
I would lead off my answer to that one by saying, what first, I'm impressed because that's the first time I've gotten that question. I thought I'd gotten all of them at this point. The definition of a tipped employee is that you're in an industry or you are an employee that regularly makes more than $30 per pay period in tips. So I think that probably cover just about every single guide in the country. Now, I think the question is whether or not, if your outfitter doesn't claim that you are a tipped employee, so doesn't take a tip credit, could you just say that you're not a tipped guide and not claim your tips? I'm not a lawyer. It's not legal advice. I would say, from what I've read, you could probably do that. I don't think that it would hold much water if and when it came to either an investigation or audit of the outfitter or you as an employee. So it'd be a pretty significant risk, especially for the outfitter, because the consequences for the employer are logarithmically higher than they would be for, even tax fraud as an employee, which is what that would be. But I think possible, but huge roll of the dice, in short. Does that sound right, Leah?
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go to another one that I think is kind of one that I've been hearing quite a bit, and I think you guys will be able to get to the point of it is, as we said, how are outfitters going to see increased payroll, but guides won't see an increase in pay?
Happy. Yeah. Okay. So how could outfitters see an increase in payroll where guides don't see an increase in pay? I think part of it is, so in simple terms, take-home pay has is more than just what you were paid per hour on paper. So if I'm paid $200 per day on a trip wage, or I'm just going to call it daily wage to make it simple. If I'm paid $200 for a day, and that doesn't include my tips, and I don't claim my tips, or let's just say I don't claim my tips, and I'm not taxed on my tips, then I make more in that situation, given that I am making tips, I would if I were taxed, depending on what my tax bracket is, 12, 22%, whatever it might be. But between those, on whatever tips I make, increased costs for outfitters also come from different places. So from a guide's perspective, we just see, here's what my pay is. A lot of outfitters that I've talked to are hiring more office staff to deal with the paperwork that goes along with this. So there's a huge amount of reporting that has to occur. And that's frankly one of the bigger issues for outfitters. There's a huge amount of reporting that has to occur on the outfitters end of things. And just figuring out how to record things in the first place, let alone report what you record, is pretty arcane stuff and confusing. So there's additional organizational overhead or operational overhead that's involved in it. It applies not just to guides, but to the extent that they work more than 20%, spend more than 20% of their time and other activities to other support staff for the organization. And it stands to increase things like workers' comp. So there are other costs to outfitters that we don't necessarily see as guides from the guiding end that could increase costs. I'd say, as a final summary, there's a huge, and as Leah said, there's a huge amount of variability here. So I agree that I think for most outfitters, this will increase costs. And for most guides, they will stand, if not most, then a significant proportion, lion's share of guides stand to effectively not take home as much. I think there are instances where outfitters won't pay more, and where their maybe rates are already high or trip costs are already on the upper end, or where guides might make incrementally more. There's a huge amount of variability in the system, but that'd be a summary answer.
And yeah, I would just chime in to say that, let's say, again, just to keep using the Middle Fork example, because if we keep it on the same river, that's gonna make the most sense, I think. On a 6-day Middle Fork trip, if you walk out of there with $1,000 tip, and let's say you have a winter job, you're ski patrolling or doing whatever else, if you're making somewhere in the $50,000 range a year, you're going to have to report that tip, and effectively that's 22% of that $1,000 tip, because that tip becomes income. The $1,000 becomes ordinary income, and tax rates are applied to that ordinary income. So there's a ton of variability in terms of your tax rates and everything Aaron just said. But the fact is, when tips become ordinary income and you're taxed on it, $1,000 tip is now what, an $800 tip or less. So I think that's, in terms of the simplest thing, that's going to be a big chunk. And then the increased cost to the employers, all of these other things. Like when I first became an employer and started paying payroll, I was like, holy shit, this is really, it's so much different being on the employer side of that, because you're paying all of these other costs.
Payroll taxes, workers' comp.
Yeah, that your employees don't see. So if you Google cost to employer of one employee, every incremental dollar or two or three in raises has an associated impact on the back end. So there's a lot of these costs that, as an employee, I didn't understand how that worked at all. And so that's how that juxtaposition happens. Employers are going to be paying more and adding more staff and absorbing all the costs associated with higher payroll, additional staff, additional record keeping requirements, additional time out of their lives during the season, which is tough. And then employees, while in theory you should be making more, in actuality, when you're a tipped employee, it's going to change what actually goes in your pocket. I think that's the bottom line.
And one more thing on that front, the other thing that we didn't really speak to, and I'll probably leave it pretty top level because it gets complicated, but the other thing that goes along with this, and Leah had it up in the beginning of her presentation, is the tip. So tipped employees and tip credit will be phased out over the next 3-ish years. And that sounds, so phasing out the tip credit sounds great, right? As a guide, it's like, oh, well, they can never claim against my tips in 3 years. And sure, like, again, I'm a guide, like on paper, I say, yeah, that looks great. Until you start really thinking it through, because realistically what that means is now the ability, so they can't realistically raise costs equivalent to the amount of payroll that they will have increases with the loss of the tip credit, but that tip credit will go away. And what that means is they're going to now have to some way to keep their payroll costs and all the things that go along with those direct payrolls manageable. And those might be, if you ran one multi-day trip last week, you're not on the next one. It could be certain days off if you're on a 1-day guide. It could be, things as silly to think about, but as going and getting way more expensive food so that you can calculate options and meal costs, because you're trying to figure out how to keep your payroll within something, not that is necessarily making you a huge amount of money, but that you can literally sustain as an operator. So there are costs down the road that I think we'd be smart as guides and as outfitters, but smart as guides and outfitters to think about together, because we don't want to push each other into a corner.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, I looked at it as it takes guides freedom with their tips away a lot. We get to make a lot of decisions currently, and it would definitely push us into a corner on that. Next one that I think we should talk about is how are trainees and swampers to be paid? Will the same rate and overtime be applied to them? Is there any sort of exemption?
So I can start real briefly. Feel free to interrupt at any point on the first answer, Leah. But the trainee and swamper question is a tough one. There are a couple different. So it's a tough one for this reason, that without taking advantage of some type of exemption, the baseline is that all employees will be subject to the same minimum wage. And what that means is that an employer, so this is another thing that actually makes it that speaks to the last question as well. But if I want to pay my 15-year senior pack guide $15 more, or whatever more than I want to pay the apprentice hunt guide, then I effectively now just have to inflate both of those rates, because I can't reduce the rate of the trainee, at least without taking advantage of some exemptions. I can't reduce the rate of the trainee below the federal minimum hourly wage rate. That said, there are several limited possibilities folks can look at. So whether, people who want to be guides getting into the industry, or outfitters looking to bring people on as trainees, one, there are certain limited exemptions for apprenticeship. The parameters around that, to my understanding, are pretty tight, having to demonstrate how it plays into some sort of educational component, similarly with internships. And there is an exemption for folks 20 or younger from full FLSA minimum wage hourly rates. So there are some very limited exemptions that people could potentially fit into. I'd say the downsides to those are, one, they're extremely limited, and several of them specifically around either age or whether you're a student. Two of the three potential ones. So 20 or younger, and whether or not you're a student. And the other is just that there's additional, again, more paperwork, more reporting, and more things that neither the trainee nor the outfitter has time to do or wants to do, that go along with them, which make it really complicated.
You there? Get on that one, Leah.
Yep.
Okay. This one's a little long, but I think we'll be able to get to it. The exemption for overtime pay until 56 hours a week that ski areas use was applicable to lodges and food service. These businesses were deemed to be federal concessionaires. What are the chances of us falling into that category? Us being outfitters and guides.
Let me do that one. It's easy. Slim to none for most. There may be some really limited exceptions, but that's highly unlikely for anyone that I know in Idaho.
I'd say that's a summary. Yeah.
That was a good idea.
If you're unsure, definitely ask your lawyer to look into it if you think you might be eligible for the recreational establishment exemption. But as I said, I think the odds are extremely low for most people in Idaho.
Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from someone asking about how things will be affected if they operate in multiple states. Are there any differences in how each location's payroll will be managed? I don't know if we can really get into that too specifically because we're IOGA, but I don't know if you have any advice for him, Aaron.
I mean, I think Leah and I might have the same short answer, which is short answer, there are definitely differences. So wage and hour laws interact differently with federal laws depending on state by state basis, including for tipped employees, including based on what your minimum is in your state, and there are different rules around that. Usually the rule is that whichever is more, as always seems to be the case, whichever is more or is a higher amount or is more demanding takes precedence, and when all else equal, federal. The league can speak to that part. I'd say I imagine it's going to make it more complicated, especially on the operational end of things. As a guide working across states, I don't know that it would be too much beyond potential tax reporting. I don't think it'd be too much more complicated for a guide working than working in two different states and in one. If they're working for one outfitter across different states, that could be significant for the outfitter. Leah, you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I think that could be really complicated, and it illustrates another weird thing that some of you might run into, particularly this summer. If you recall from those first couple of slides, if your outfitter is under the Obama executive order versus the Biden executive order, those minimum, that hourly minimum is different, and some of the rules are slightly different. So you could all be, again, using Middle Fork as an example, everybody could be at Boundary, hanging out on boats, talking to each other, and depending on your outfitter, their specific permitting circumstances, what deductions they've chosen, their business model, all the factors that go into their analysis, you could be paid very differently than you were with your buddy last year. Like, you could be making significantly different money for no reason that has anything to do with merit or makes any sense. So keep that in mind when you're having conversations with among each other about what's happening with you or how much are you getting paid. There's outfitters are getting shuffled into one line or another, and then mini mazes within those subway lines, depending on which executive order they're in. And so it, what's happening with your friend may bear no resemblance to what will be happening with you. And that may not have anything to do with anyone being greedy or sneaky or anything else. It's just the way it is based on the law. So that's your question that we didn't answer very well raised that point that I wanted to mention.
Awesome. Next question would be, how does the executive order affect multi-day trips that are partly on federal lands and then maybe move on to tribal or state lands for other parts of it?
I think as long as your outfitter is operating under a federal permit, it won't matter if you're partially moving through tribal or state lands, the rules will apply in the same way.
Yep. It depends on the authorization. Yep.
Yeah, great question though.
Where can we find this payroll information to understand if we aren't in compliance in one way or another?
So one place, I mean, a standard place, there's all sorts of information on the Department of Labor website. I've spent a lot of time on there. I can't say that it's a happy place. And you really have to go around to like 15 different fact sheets to triangulate the question you're trying to answer sometimes. That said, IOGA has been putting together, we've been putting together a tool guide resource for outfitters and guides that is, I think, as streamlined and comprehensive at the same time as it can be. Been really trying to get it out. Been working on it since the final rule came around in late November, and should have it out to our members and partners here in the next 2 weeks or so. So that'll probably be the best resource once it is out for outfitters guides specifically, especially if you operate in Idaho. Beyond that, Department of Labor. And Leah, any other suggestions?
No, I mean, at this point, I think there are a lot of different organizations trying to compile resources. And that's what I've told a lot of my clients, some of whom are on here, is wait and let's get a joint resource so everybody's operating off the same template, and then everyone will have to get individual advice from there. And for employees, yeah, it's just, you can go to the Department of Labor website, but it's so complicated. And if you don't, like, if you don't know what year your outfitter's permit was issued, then you're missing the first branch in the subway. So that's going to be pretty difficult to understand until your outfitter has a good handle on it. And then you can fact check from there.
We mentioned new forms and reporting. Is this new reporting mandated by the EO?
Well, so what the EO puts in place itself accompanies additional reporting. So to the extent that the EO makes it, the EO, the rule, and the renewed or particular focus on the outfitting industry, outfitting guiding industry, those things combined mean that the record keeping and reporting that outfitters previously were required to do or supposed to do, but maybe wasn't such a big deal or wasn't being enforced, that those now are a much bigger deal. Tracking employee hours period. like having as an employee signing off that, yeah, I mean, they had a great example of, I woke up at 9 p.m. to go tie off my boat. Do I now, when I get off the trip, have to sign the document that says that I didn't have a full 8 hours sleep? Technically I do. So there are a number of things that maybe were tacitly required previously, but not effectively enforced by the department that now there's a greater onus on. I don't believe that there's any specific forms that weren't technically requisite before that now exist. Can you think of anything, Leah?
No.
Back to an overtime issue. What are the implications for guide hours, such as being on call 24/7? Are we going to be on 24/7? Are we getting paid for all that? What will that look like?
I can take
Go
a
ahead.
shot at that, Aaron, and jump in if you disagree. So my basic interpretation is as long as so if you're a multi-day guide, as long as you can get 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep, your sleep time is probably okay not to count that as overtime. That's my sense right now. Now that's going to be subject to legal challenge, I'm sure, and that might change, but I think that your sleeping hours, you can probably, those probably won't be counted as overtime hours. Outfitters and guides, it would be smart to come to agreement on what your sleeping hours are and put that in writing. That way everybody's on the same page and you can have a conversation about it. And that would exempt outfitters from paying overtime for when you're actually just asleep. Everything else, like the example I used, not that I ever went and took a bath with a beer and ignored clients, but I think I would still get overtime pay for that if I were a guide, because you're not actually asleep. That's my sense of how that would work right now.
Yeah, I think I agree. The question was, are all hours overtime, right?
Yeah, basically, what was the day established, I believe. Sorry, I'm trying to make the questions.
Line them up.
Mess anybody up. And
I think that's a good
I
summary.
believe that's what they're looking for. Yeah,
I think Leah hit it. Like, sleep is the main thing. There are some questions about whether or not, if you have a set schedule, as Leah recommended folks having, which I also think is a good idea now. If you do have a set work schedule, so say like, I'm going to assign numbers to the guides on a trip, and guide 3 is off from 4 p.m. on at camp and can helicopter out, can do whatever, is not required at camp. Like, there are real questions of whether or not that is considered compensable time. Unfortunately, the Department of Labor doesn't have any guidance that strictly applies to our industry. It just wasn't built for the things we do. So sleep is really, to Leah's point, sleep is really the only one that's yes, this is covered. We know that this is a thing in their handbook.
Is there an interpretation that overtime is any time after 8 hours in a day, or is it consecutive up to 40 hours? Does it roll over? What is a standard week from the payroll standpoint? Kind of
state by state.
Yeah.
So sorry, it kind of broke up there for me. What was that?
It's state by overtime. So whether it's 8 hours or so, if you work one day and you work 9 hours that day, is that 9th hour overtime, versus is it after the first 40 hours, do you then go over to overtime? And the rule is it's going to be state by state ultimately.
There's kind of a longer one here as well. If a business was guide owned with shared ownership and those guides all ran trips, would they fall under these same rules? And if the outfitter is working as a guide, are they exempt? Not sure. It's kind of a question. Sorry, I should have left.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's so many smart questions here. It's pretty awesome. So if you own a business and you're also guiding, you can choose to be paid as an employee, or you can choose to be to compensate yourself differently. So if you're an employee, if you choose to be paid as an employee, you'd be compensated in the same way. And I think every business owner would probably just do what made the most sense financially. And if I totally missed the question, feel free to correct it.
Yeah, assume that addresses it. There's the question that we all assumed we would get asked. Can outfitters make guides salaried employees?
No, not by, so short answer is no, not by the standard definition. There is, so it'll be misleading. I'll just mention there is like a use of the term salary when folks are talking about different work week methods. That is sometimes that you'll hear maybe as a guide when we're talking about this stuff. Don't fall into that trap. It's a different technical meaning for salary. To what the question really is, like, if I'm an employer, can I pay my guide salary? Or if I'm in the traditional sense, like we all mean it, or if I'm a guide, can my outfitter pay me salary? I've probably gotten that question from outfitters as much as any other single question, which I think is kind of cool. Unfortunately, the answer is no. And in part, it has to do with the nature, like in how employee-employer relationships are defined. So if and what exemptions you can get. So there's a criterion for your salary. You have to be paid X amount as a minimum in order to be considered a salaried employee and salaried exempt employee. And in addition to that salary minimum, which the salary minimum, I think many outfitters were like, hey, I'll pay that. Beyond that, there's a limited set of exempt classes, and that's not the actual term that labor uses, but so it's executive, administrative, or professional employees, employees of seasonal amusement, which is not us, despite how it sounds, farm workers. There are certain exemptions. Unfortunately, none of those actually apply to guides. So long answer where it's really a short one is no.
You'd make a great lawyer.
I know.
Another kind of interesting one. How would drinking on the job affect overtime hours? Can an employer not pay you overtime if you are drinking, at camp or something like that?
My sense, again, it's going to depend a little bit on the specifics, but in the traditional way that the job goes, if you are having a beer with clients and you're entertaining clients and that's part of how you connect with them, I think you're on the clock would be my likely interpretation for most people. Aaron, any disagreements there?
I think that's probably true. I mean, it's not defined. I guess the question is not answered by the Department of Labor in any of their fact sheets, or it's just another example of how our industry doesn't quite align with how these things are put together.
Yeah, so I mean, on that point, the executive order is something like 243 pages, and then there's all these fact sheets that the Department of Labor issues. There is virtually no useful information in any of that in terms of hard and fast rules for how a lot of these things apply. A lot of the questions you're asking, there's not a lot of guidance because, again, it just wasn't built for this industry. So a lot of it just doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
Point being, I'm sorry, just one more thing. The point being there is that we right now, and me, what I'm advising clients, I'm giving my best interpretation of what I think the likely answer would be in court. And that's frankly educated guess. And that's what we're doing here tonight too, is Aaron and I both are trying to give you an educated guess based on what we know right now.
I think this is another good question. We have these interpretations of overtime, work at camp time, that kind of stuff. Can a guide and outfitter create an agreement on what is considered overtime, and would that hold water? moving forward?
So it is
Some tough
encouraged
questions,
that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, they're honestly really good questions.
Yeah.
For sure.
There is reason for guides to go to their applicants or applicants to their guides and just sit down and figure out. So if folks as a group say, hey, it makes sense for us to try to put a schedule together where on day 2, this person is off after this time, barring unforeseens. So to work out schedules, things like that, to define what is compensable time, at least within their company, and their comfortability based on FAQs or other guidance from the Department of Labor and stuff that we put out, but mostly from labor. The question of, can an outfitter and guide like work out between themselves what overtime is? No, overtime is overtime. It's what it means. Whether it's after 8 hours or after 40, that's a matter that changes state by state. What is compensable to get you to the point where you hit overtime has a little bit more wiggle, I think. But not once you get to overtime. That's a fairly black and white definition. Do you agree, Leah?
I agree.
no?
I agree. Yeah. So things like this sleep concept. If I was working as a guide, outfitters and the guides could agree, okay, we agree this is sleep time and this is not compensable, doesn't count towards overtime because it's not worked hours. So there's wiggle room about what counts towards hitting that overtime threshold. But even there's not that much wiggle room in the Department of Labor rules. I think erring on the side of most of that time, if you're not eyes shut, is compensable, I think is probably the way to go.
And labor even has a statement in one of their factions that says, if you have any question as to whether time is compensable, the answer, like in short, the answer is yes, for whatever that's worth, which is not a lot.
Okay, just in the essence of time, I'm going to try and knock it down to these last couple of questions. I think I got 2 more that I'm gonna ask you guys, and then we'll do a little outro. What is your sense about how stable this EO is? It seems messy and problematic. Do you think the requirements will evolve?
I mean, I could go, but you're the lawyer. I'll gladly ride your coattails on that one.
I mean, so there's 2 ways that this could evolve: in court or in a lobbying effort or in a change of administration in DC. Those are the avenues. Could it change in court? That's not looking very promising. So I would say that's not likely based on the lawsuits that I'm aware of right now. I think the more likely thing to happen is, how we talked about the Obama, then Trump removed outfitters and guides, exempted them by executive order, and then Biden reinstated it. So that process can run its course infinitely unless there's legislation. So if there's a change in administration or there's a successful lobbying effort, we might be able to be re-exempted, but then someone else could just put it right back in. So it's the definition of unstable is what I would say. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I agree. Is it? Yeah, it is more likely than not that it will change in some form or fashion. In fact, we know it will by a scheduled approach, whether some partial exemption or rescission or exemption for our industry or rescission of the order itself or any of the rules around it. So redefinition of guides, outfitters as not contractors, stuff like that might happen. I think it probably will. It's just a question of will that happen in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, and by what means.
And our next question, actually, I set it up that way that it would roll into each other. Is there an effort to appeal or rethink this executive order for outfitters? Is there an effort to get an exemption or something else more fitting for our industry?
Aaron, you know more about that than I do.
Short answer is, I suppose, yes. I think I would qualify that by saying it's important to frame out in what way, like where that push is going. So there's a legislative push that AO has been working on for quite a while, or American Outdoors Association's been working on for quite a while, that a lot of our IOGA members have been working on for quite a while. Shoot, Grant Simons was working on it 10 years ago. It's been an ongoing thing, which is around daily wages and overtime. And that hasn't really changed too much. It's become more immediate now. But I think the legislative push at this point is really around consideration of unique elements of our industry and around daily wage, trip wage, and some either consideration or exclusion from strict overtime and reporting requirements. I say all of those words just to say that it's not really, the push has not been about minimum wage, and that from the industry's perspective, it's unlikely, I think, at least from IOGAs, speaking to the extent I can for the board and committee, that I don't think there's really an interest in pushing on minimum wage increases, because frankly, that's not the real issue for most folks. So yes, kind of. And I think one of the things that, this is just a starting point. One of the things these conversations do is help us figure out, like, how do we do that? And like, is that something we can do? Because really, this, the industry only works if both outfitters and guides are on board with whatever we're doing. So,
yeah, and I'd jump in here and say that's maybe one of the main reasons I was kind of hopeful of this being a big success, is to kind of gauge people, engage our guides, and show them that, there's a lot of things on the table that maybe don't necessarily fit our industry the way we like, and having guide support behind all that would move us in a direction of maybe having one of those solutions that we're talking about. So this is kind of part of the foundation of that. We're working that direction. But anyways, I'll let you go, Leah.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your attention. I'm really, really psyched that so many people showed up here. It's really cool that you're taking such an interest, and spread the word. The more involvement that we have here, and we can build this into a community effort and community understanding, and hope everybody stays in business and comes along together. That would be my greatest wish for what we could get out of these Zoom sessions. So thanks, Stephen, the committee, for putting it together. It's been a lot of people have put a lot of work into trying to figure this out, and I hope everybody's thankful for that. And thank Aaron, who's been doing a lot of math, even though he's terrible at spreadsheets, trying to figure this out for everyone. I usually say that I'm happy to have people email questions, and I am to some extent, but I'm also really slammed right now. So you can email me, but do it judiciously, and be patient with me if you have a question.
So I just say, I don't want to interrupt you. I want you to keep going. I just say, for Leah's sake, feel free to email overtime@ioga.org. And then, I usually harass Leah with the questions I can't answer, which are a lot of them, whenever that comes up anyway. So it's easier for her to put that on just the one person. Sorry, Leah, go ahead.
No, that's a perfect exit. I'm going to go home and get some dinner. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Leah. All right, Aaron, I'll do a little closing unless you have something you want to say, which you more than welcome. You have a little closing.
I'll just say real briefly, I really appreciate everybody coming out. And thanks, Stephen. Stephen's been a driver on all this. We're lucky to have him on the board. And lucky to have him representing guides. One of the points that the board ended up coming around to, not least for some of Stephen's input, was that this is around, about whether or not we want to join the lawsuit when we were asked to, was this is a decision that fundamentally affects guides that we can't have in a vacuum without guides, without more guide input, let alone more input from, outfitters. But guides were a central part of that, and not least because of Stephen advocating for you guys. So, so hopefully you thank him too, send him some nice notes, and tell your friends, hopefully come back for the next installments in this, and pass it on to you, Stephen.
Thanks. Yeah, before everybody starts to jump off, I appreciate everybody coming out. There was way more people than I was expecting, and I'm so glad that was that way. And thanks to Aaron and Leah for answering all these tough questions and putting a bunch of work into it. One big thing is, if you want to watch the recording, we will have that recording. We're going to send it out on an IOGA newsletter. Also, if you would like to contact the overtime committee, you're a guide and you'd like to join the overtime committee, we're still looking for people to join us. Absolutely. Use that overtime@ioga.org for all those things. We can also send you the Zoom link for the recording as well. I saw Lauren also put her email in there. Lots of options to get that out. Please take that, share it with your friends who maybe missed the event. And then the final thing that I'm going to say is, we're hoping this is installment one of multiple. We're going to kind of, as we've got a little bit here, we're going to try and get a little bit more in depth of what we're really trying to do, talk about those legislative solutions, possibly things like that moving forward, how this is really going to affect us in the long run. But yeah, so that was kind of my closing statement. And thank you everybody for coming, and hopefully I'll see you out there on the river, in the mountains. So I don't know. Thank you everybody.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thanks, Stephen.